Imagine for a moment a world without art, without dance, opera, literature, poetry. That world would be a very, very dull place.
On this episode, we have Dr. Barbara J. Reisman, Distinguished Professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Barbara is the author of the book Families as They Really Are, Gender Vertigo, American Families in Transition, and over 24 journal articles in venues including the American Sociological Review, Gender in Society, and the Journal of Marriage and Family. She has been the editor of the Journal of Contemporary Sociology. She has been the co-chair and executive officer of the Council of Contemporary Families, past president of the Southern Sociological Society, and previously served as the vice president of the American Sociological Association. Barbara has blogged for the Huffington Post and wrote op-eds for CNN.com, as well as the Chicago Tribune. Reisman has a regular column on Psychology Today entitled Gender Matters, and in 2005, Dr. Reisman was honored with the Catherine Locker Bell Boone Award from the Southern Sociological Society of Lifetime Contributions to the Study of Gender. She was also named as the 2013 Feminist Lecturer by the Sociologist of Women in Society. In 2011, Dr. Reisman was honored with the American Sociological Association's Award for Public Understanding of Sociology. She was awarded the 100 Women That Mattered at North Carolina State University. Her new book, entitled Where the Millennials Will Take Us, A New Generation Wrestles with Gender Structure, Reisman analyzes life history and interviews with Chicagoland millennials, with a sample both gender diverse and a majority minority. This book provides a unique insight into today's young adults. You can follow her work and keep informed at www.barbarareisman.com. All right. Thanks for coming on the show, Barbara. I really love speaking with anybody from the academic background that you have because, I'll talk with someone who's a lot smarter than you. You're always going to learn something new every conversation you have. So I want to thank you for taking the time and speaking with me today.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. So before we kind of, delve into the topic of, gender studies and, just kind of your research that you have, primarily your new book dealing with millennials' perception on the matter, I kind of wanted to get your take as a sociologist on, everything that's going on today with this pandemic. I know we had originally planned to do this in your office, and I was looking forward to coming down to campus. But, we ended up not having to do that. We're both locked in our houses now as part of the pandemic. So I just kind of wanted to get your take on everything that's going around and I guess how we, from a sociological perspective and a psychological perspective, should be coping with the situation.
That's a great question. And I really have two things I think about this. The first one I want to talk about is I worry a little bit about people's mental health. There's lots of medical folks around who are worrying about our physical health and the virus itself, but I think we're underestimating just how much this might affect our mental health. And that is, many of us are locked in to relatively small places with people we love. Some of us are locked into relatively small places with people we don't necessarily love. But even if we are with families we love, this is a very anxious time. And people have all sorts of anxiety that they carry around with them in everyday life, even when the world is going smoothly. And so the kinds of anxiety that people will feel now, afraid of getting sick, afraid of who they know who might get sick, but also simply dealing 24 hours a day with their kids at home or with spouses who they love but don't necessarily spend 24 hours a day with most of their lives. And so I think that it's very important that we think about people's mental health and pay attention to ways in which we can decrease anxiety. We can, everyone has their own ways. I think that the problem is that some people decrease their anxiety with ways that are actually destructive. I worry a little bit about people drinking too much while they're home alone or home trying to escape the anxiety of perhaps their families.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I think that we should be focused on trying to find positive ways to reduce anxiety, from at home yoga practices to online workouts that you can find for
Hmm.
free,
Hmm.
meditation. So one thing I'm worried about at a psychological level is people's mental health. I also think even though the city's parks and lakefront are now closed, we are still allowed to go out and walk for half an hour or an hour a day on city streets. And I think that's a very healthy thing to do physically, but it's also very healthy for a kind of mental anxiety release. And so that's one thing. The other thing is more related to my research and to the topic of the day, and that is gender. And that is every uh, part of life is gendered, so to speak. That is often experienced differently by women and men.
Hmm.
But so too is this pandemic, because in many families, certainly not all, but in many heterosexual families, women still do more than a fair share of household and child rearing. And in this moment, the amount of household labor and child tending has just grown explosively. Most children go off to school during the day. No one is expected to teach them at home. Similarly, most not 3 meals a day at home are hardly ever anyone's responsibility to cook and clean up after, because very rarely do all members of a family spend 24 hours a day, or maybe 23 or 22 and a half if they go out for a walk, locked into their homes. And so I think that there is a chance that this pandemic will decrease the quality of women's, and especially mothers in heterosexual relationships or single mothers' lives
Hmm.
dramatically. On the other hand, and I have a column in Psych Today, and I'm just in the middle of writing a new column about this, it's also a time where people have the time to reassess and adjust. It is not the case that in heterosexual households that women need to do more than their fair share. They do so because of ingrained habits or perhaps unexamined expectations of male privilege of their partners. It may even have something to do with differential expectations for what good enough is for house cleaning or child rearing between the partners. But those things happen and don't get challenged and don't get changed because we're all so busy all the time. When you have work and kids and leisure activities and aging parents, nobody has time to sort of take a deep breath and say, are we organizing our lives the way we really want to, the optimal way, the fair way, the way that live up to our own values? No, mostly we're just like managing to get through the day. We're in a moment, not because we've chosen to be, but we are, where most families are together much more and have more time on their hands than ever before. The kids' games are all canceled. Any theater tickets people have, any bingo games they go to, even church events, since church Bible studies, everything's canceled. Some of them are online, but it takes you a third as much time to go to a Bible study if it's only the study and not the 45 minutes going and coming. And so we all have more time in our lives, and it could be a moment where families sit down and talk about who's doing what and why.
Hmm.
We have to do that for our kids, anyways, because kids have much more time to chip in on family work than they usually do. And so, those are the two things I think about when I think about the pandemic. First, the kind of mental health issues, and second, the opportunity it gives us to reassess and readjust and think about the equity and the fairness in our households.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that too, because when I don't know, at least talking with other folks, via social media, other ways, I've been kind of promoting the idea to use this time as a way to center oneself and recentering on what's important in life. When with all those external things removed, it really gives you a chance to not only look at yourself internally and what you would like to change and what you would like to focus on, but coming from a family perspective, it also allows you to focus on the family structure and focus on how you can kind of reorganize that in a way that would be beneficial for that individual unit. But looking at the gender roles in the family, I mean, just kind of coming from I will just admit a complete layman as far as gender studies goes. It's been a while since I've taken a class since college, but the one thing I think that is the biggest misconception about gender is the idea of actual gender roles as a sociological construct versus biological sex. You go on Facebook, you go on Twitter, people misinterpret the idea of gender as being biological. And I think that, I don't know, I'd like to get your opinion on how we can just kind of remessage that and make that distinction clearer for, everyday Americans to understand.
I think that's really important. And we've actually, I think, been going in the wrong direction here because when you try to fly on an airplane, you have to tell them what gender you are, and then they ask you what is your gender, and then they give you your choices as male and female. And actually, gender isn't male or female. Gender is how masculine or feminine you feel or are expected to behave. And in some ways that's really quite distinct from biological sex. And so I think it's really important to note that we are all born and ascribed into a sex, and that's usually based on the shape of our genitals at birth. As we grow older, other biological um, measurements are also involved in that, including hormones. But at birth, we're put into a category based on the whether or not we have vaginas or penises. That is quite distinct from what gender is about. Gender is all those expectations that come with being expected to behave as a woman or man. And from my perspective, even that is a very narrow idea about gender. Gender is also the way we've organized our society so that the roles that we expect women and men to play in the family and in the economy
Hmm.
are different. And so it's really very different. I think one way we can try to work towards cleaning up um, this misinterpretation is by being careful how we use language. When we say mean gender, we shouldn't say sex, which means what kind of genitals do you have in the most simple way, or and gender, how are you expected to act? How do you expect yourself to act? And the way in which society is organized around the historical understanding of sex as having only two categories.
Well, and I think a lot of that goes back to the way that we have utilized those roles as a way to play a function in society. I forget the specific theory. I know you can enlighten me a little bit more on it, but you go back way back when to like hunter gatherers, where men were primarily like big game hunters. Women would primarily gather things as well as take care of the kids. More home life, and since both those roles worked functionality, supporting the tribe and keeping the tribe together. It's kind of those roles that have been expounded upon as different, gender skill sets, I guess you could say, have been kind of compartmentalized into those different roles to the point that society, Western society in particular, has, expounded those roles and expounded those skill sets into almost personality types that we have to fill based on some sort of tradition or social conditioning.
That's a really important point. I do want to clarify the one thing about those hunter and gatherers.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely the case that men were mostly the hunters and women were mostly the gatherers. However, what we tend to forget is that in most of those early tribes, the gatherers provided about 80%, anthropologists tell us, of the actual caloric intake of the
Oh yeah.
tribe.
Oh yeah.
If if you want to think about that in a traditional sense, those gatherers were at least equal breadwinners, or that is in bringing in the food as the hunters. The hunters the hunters didn't have bullets. They had spears, poison spears, and things. And so they would spend a great deal of time following around an animal before they actually killed it. And it was a feast, and it was very important for, of course, the uh, intake of protein,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't the stable food source. The stable people who provisioned food for those tribes were the gatherers. And so I think what I want you to understand is that over time, men and women in different places did have different skill sets, absolutely, but both skill sets were about producing goods and services to make life happen. That is, both men and women worked in the economy. It wasn't until an economic uh, moment in history, a very recent one, really, the Industrial Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
when we harnessed the power of um, and the energy of turbines and then fossil fuels, that we needed fewer and fewer people to do the economic labor to keep society running. And it was only then, only in the middle of the late 1800s in Western Europe and later in the rest of the world, that we redefined in our minds male and female skill sets, which is that somehow women are supposed to be nurturers, and that's their major skill set, and men are about the economy. That is a radical, short lived modern notion. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that women's skill sets were not about economic provisioning for their households and families. It has only in a post industrial or the post the Industrial Revolution that women came to be defined as the ones whose primary job ought to be child rearing. And so I think that the stereotype we have in our mind is that comes from the mid 1950s,
Mm-hmm.
post World War II, which is, the traditional family is one where men go out to the work and women take care of children. If you're old enough to remember the show Leave It to Beaver,
Mm-hmm.
or right reruns of Leave It to Beaver, that was the sort of model. Ozzie and Harriet, that was a very short moment in history. And yet it has a deep imprint right now on our notion of what the skill sets of men and women are, whereas women are somehow supposed to be better at child rearing and responsible for child rearing, when that actually wasn't their full-time job at all until very modern history.
I find that interesting too that it came about just at that time because, during World War II, women really had to step up. They had to take charge of the economy, during the wartime. And I mean, I don't know, it just makes me feel like there was some sort of conceited effort to try and push that narrative, whether it's through, trying to solidify a consumer base, marketing strategies for, the I don't know, just all the consumer products that this new industrial era has created. Do you think that it was just kind of a marketing push by companies in this new economy prior to, or post war to try and kind of establish what they wanted the ideal family to be from a consumer perspective?
That may have been part of it. I do think the vast majority of it, however, was to get women to leave the labor force so that there would be jobs for returning vets. In
Okay.
fact, there was a tremendous amount of government propaganda, big billboards at the end of World War II. Be patriotic. Give your job to a vet. So there was propaganda, but there was also um, very effective closing of all those daycare centers that were open during World War II. They
Hmm.
closed them. So women with young children were both bombarded with the message that the patriotic thing to do was give their job to a vet, and they sort of had to because the alternative for working parents, or in that era working mothers, to stay working was childcare, and those childcare centers were closed. So I think that really solidified the push of women out of the labor force. But you will notice, if you follow the historical story, that it didn't really last very long. By the mid 1960s, women began organizing, particularly women with college educations at this moment, because they were the ones who were first pushed out of the labor force. Women who were working class were married, more likely to be married to men that couldn't support families on one income, and women of color were much more likely to be in that group. They were still working, many of them as domestics, but middle class women were pushed out of the labor force, particularly middle class white women, and they began to feel uh, notice that their lives were um, not as fulfilling as they'd hoped they would be. And there were by 1960, middle of 1960s, there were already headlines in magazines, babies, uh, color schemes, and what else
Hmm.
kinds of. Um, and so we began to see the development of uh, women moving back into labor force very quickly after the zenith of the women at home and homemaker world. And so I just think it's important as we think about today and where we are with gender today to see sort of what's happened historically. And so after World War II, we had this moment of the vast majority of women who were married outside of the labor force. In fact, by the middle of the 1950s, about 12% of married women work full time. And so you can see that's pretty low. But then in the 60s and the 70s, we had two different streams of women moving back into the labor force. First, middle class, college educated women went back into the labor force, mostly when their kids were old enough to go into elementary school, because by then, we still didn't have any daycare centers yet. But then in the 1970s and early 80s, we had uh, a vast movement of women remaining into the labor force even after child rearing and childbearing. And that started to be uh, for two reasons. One was the deindustrialization of America, We had that was the beginning of the industrial work and the beginning of the end of the power of unions, and jobs went overseas. And so you started having a lot of uh, middle working class, well paid jobs disappearing. You also had the increase in the cost of housing,
Mhm.
particularly in cities. And so you had the need for two incomes to pay for a mortgage, which was always the American dream, to own a home. And so we saw that big increases of women into the labor force uh, till it the increases started becoming less strong in the 21st century. But we had, by the time you entered the 20th century, which is when millennials come of age,
Mhm.
right, is in this new century, we had a very different world where most millennials are raised in families where mothers worked at least part of the time they were growing up, and for many of them throughout their childhood.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing that just kind of going back a little bit there, you were talking about how media, propaganda at the time, how that was really pushing this idea of a family narrative. So, just looking at the kind of uh, difference between the perception of the boomer generation and the millennial generation. Are there any stark differences that you've noticed on how boomers view the concept of family versus the millennials viewing their concept of family?
Well, that's a really good question, and it actually is a piece of research that I have written on. I have a paper with uh, two co-authors published a year or two ago, looking at the attitude trends over time using what's called the General Social Survey, which is a random sample of Americans that's been done every year since the middle of the 20th century up until the 2019. I mean, we'll do one in 2020 as well. And what we find really is interesting, and that is the big shifts in belief about uh, gender patterns and women and men's roles in the family actually happen with the baby boom generation.
Okay.
They're the ones who really changed dramatically in the belief that men and women should be equal, that women should have an equal right to be in the workforce, and that the generations since then, each one has indeed come become somewhat more liberal, but the seismic shift was among baby boomers. What's changed dramatically is that among the baby boomers, there were still a percentage of people, 25 or 30, who really thought that men and women were totally different and women shouldn't at all leave the home or work for pay. By the millennial generation, there's none of those people left. There are more people who are split and unsure, but the really traditionals who think that, men are from Mars and women are from Venus have pretty much um, disappeared.
So, kind of going off of that idea, though, so with the millennials' interpretation of that family structure, I mean, millennials are really the first generation, over large to come from what would be considered non-traditional households. Have you found that that has shifted, perception on those gender roles within the family, or just gender roles at large?
Well, I want to start by saying, although I will make some generalizations about millennials, I actually, of course, did write a book called Where the Millennials Will Take Us. Uh, but part of my story is that we can't make too many generalizations,
Hmm.
because I found that millennials actually had at least four different patterns of how they're dealing with the gender structure in their lives. So I'm going to say some things that are overwhelming for all, that I think are true for most, if not all. But then I want to talk uh, a little more nuanced and suggest that millennials, like every generation, are not all the same. So the one thing I think that is pretty accurate to say that is true for nearly all millennials and the generations thereafter them, and that is that paid employment is no longer seen as a sign of being masculine. Once upon a time, that if you were in the labor force, if you worked for pay, you were seen as somehow being not traditional or not feminine or breaking some kind of a gender pattern. You were breaking or somehow some rule about being a woman if you worked for pay for your whole life. That is this idea that in a family men work for pay and women stay home and take care of children. That is really an idea that is on the dustbin of history. There, I spoke to absolutely no one, nor does the quantitative data find people in the millennial generation who believe that women should not work for pay. That is sort of out of date. And so I think that is pretty easily said. That is true even among the people I talk to who I call the true believers in gender difference.
Mm-hmm.
And that is people. Most of the true believers that I spoke to were people who were um, strong adherents to literalist faith traditions. Not any given faith tradition. It wasn't like it was one particular religion, but in every religion there's a continuum of people who believe the word is the word of God and it was written and it is not to be interpreted or understood to change over time, and then there are people who are more metaphorical about religious texts. And what I found is that the people who believe in religious texts and are part of religious communities that are very literalist, um, they are the most likely to be true believers in gender difference because God said man should be head of household and that kind of thing. Even those people have left behind the understanding of gender, including working for pay. And working for pay has nothing to do with gender anymore. And I think that's pretty new in a millennial. That the millennials are the ones who are sort of totally left behind that idea. Now, maybe if you believe men and women are really different kinds of people, and from men are from Mars and women are from Venus or something, then you think that men and women should work in different kinds of jobs. That women are better at being kindergarten teachers and nurses, and caretakers, and men are better at being the captains of industry. But not that you think that women should never earn a paycheck. And I think that's important to say out loud. And it's also important for family dynamics because I think it's really clear that when women are no longer economically totally dependent, they have more power in their heterosexual marriages. So that's one thing that I think is is a kind of generalization I'm willing to make. The other, in probably the only other real generalization I'm willing to make about the millennials around gender, is they tend to be what I call libertarian around gender. And that is, even if they themselves are traditional or conservative, or they do not talk about gender as something they feel like they should impose on other people. That is, you ask someone about should men use makeup or hair products or even nail polish, and men will say, I would never do that. But if somebody else wants to, it's none of my business. There's kind of a willingness to live and let live around gender politics that you hear from millennials that I think is, and again, I think millennials are here, the cutting edge for, I think that generations after them seem to be even more like this than millennials. But I do think that what surprised me was when I talked to people who were even very conservative about their own expectations for how they would do gender or be gendered or wanted partners. They were very unwilling to say, but I think everybody has to do it this way. And I think that is also um, important. And it's important to know, and it's important for public policy makers to hear, because millennials, of course, are at this moment the sort of almost the middle generation. They are. When I talk to the millennials in my book, I was talking to people who are between 18 and 25 or 26. But those people now, of course, are in their late 20s through their middle and even late 30s,
Hmm.
right? So,
Now, I don't know, you're just kind of backing up a little bit. The one thing I think that kind of helped millennials kind of establish that viewpoint, more that libertarian viewpoint overall, is that we were a generation, and I'm 32, so I'm at the upper echelon of that millennial cycle, but we were a generation that we don't really, and mind you, this is not any sort of academic standpoint. This is just based on my own subjective experiences talking with other millennials. We don't really associate with traditional structures as it regards to identity. Like, I look at like my dad's generation. His generation, you joined the union and that job became a true sense of your identity, right? That became a central point to who you were. And millennials, we don't identify with our jobs the way that previous generations do. We don't necessarily identify with, even just like traditional religious organizations the way previous generations do. And, when you kind of break away from those traditional structures, it allows, I don't know, it allows you to take that input elsewhere. Like, well, you were talking like the makeup and stuff, is that kind of live and let live approach. I mean, heck yeah, our generation grew up listening to David Bowie. Like, yeah, of course we're going to idolize someone like that. And, kind of breaking away from those traditional structures, allowing, pop culture icons, other sorts of media to kind of help us establish our identity. It just gives you other things to cling to. So, what are your thoughts on just the shift of millennials and how we kind of overall try and establish a sense of identity compared to previous generations?
well, being a sociologist, my question is, I agree with your analysis that your generation doesn't use a job so much to create an identity. But being a sociologist, what I want to know is how come? How did that happen? And I would like to suggest that part of the change is that your generation doesn't have the opportunity to do that. You're the generation
Right.
where the unions have become less powerful, and that corporations no longer hire someone, invest in them, and expect to give them a pension 30 years later. You're also a generation that's unlike the boomer generation, like going to end after 30 or 40 years in the labor force with, with a certain amount of money every year that comes in simply because you were a good worker. And so in some ways, you don't identify with those institutions because the institutions begin to fail you as institutions. And I think that's a really sad but real phenomenon that we have to think about. It's certainly around jobs and identities. When it comes to religion, I think it's an interesting question. And here I think the proof has yet to be um, really clear, because many generations uh, in the last since the middle of the 20th century have kind of been cyclically involved in religious institutions, and that is leave them as they come into young adulthood. And in American society, historically, children leave the home between 18 and 20 and set up independent households, but then come back when their children are ready for religious education.
Hmm.
And so it'll be interesting, I think, and I'm not making a prediction. You may be right. Millennials may not en masse come back to the religious institutions of their childhood. But I'd be interesting to see whether or not they don't shop around and find religious institutions in which to raise their children when their children are 6 or 8 or
Hmm.
whatever ages that people begin to feel like, is my child going to have any place to talk about morality and ethics
Right.
outside of my own home. And so it may be, but sociologists are terrible at predictions, but I'll make one. And that is that at least some millennials will, rather than simply go back to the religions they were raised in, they will shop for a place, a religious community, or um, that feels right and probably maybe only stay with it while their kids are in that formative stage. But that's an open question because millennials are are now um, at that moment when their children are at the higher end are entering the moment where they might go to religious education and be part of church youth groups and those kinds of things.
I mean, I 100% agree with you on how you perceived the idea of, job roles and those economic structures because, as a millennial growing up, I saw those institutions betray I saw that those institutions betray everyone. I mean, I think of my grandpa, early, actually, it was probably like mid 90s. He, worked for a steel mill for his entire life, and then they just decided to close it down, steal his pension, and, they just went on, shipped it overseas, business as usual. Same with, when I was just coming out of college, was in the midst of the housing crisis, and we saw what happened when, banks and the government got together and just kind of gave the shaft to the American worker on that one. So, we were raised in an environment where all these institutions, that said, go to school, get a good job, you'll get a house, yada, 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 live out the American dream. That was kind of found to be a facade in a lot of ways. And I don't know, at least from my opinion and my experience, I have found that millennials overall they look at the commercialization or the commodification of religion, I mean, religion's a big business nowadays. So I don't see us because of our distrust of institutions really going back and forth. But I'd be interested to see how millennials start adopting traditions or practices from various different faiths and kind of incorporate them into into a sort of ethical practice because overall I think millennials, we don't necessarily think anyone has a moral authority on ethics anymore. I don't think we think anybody has, all or one tradition has all the answers, primarily in the age of the internet where you can, look up counter viewpoints to pretty much anything.
Absolutely. And so perhaps those religious faiths and traditions that are open to more debate and conversations will be the ones that will attract millennials. We'll see.
Yeah, and I also like to, I don't know, I like to look at it from like a practical approach too, because I know a lot of millennials that they don't necessarily believe in the Hindu faith nor the Christian faith, but you know what, they do yoga, they do meditation, they do breathing exercises because those are practical ways that one can cope, one can control their breathing levels, all sorts of stuff. So I mean, the more practical the practice is, I think the more appealing it'll be to my generation, but that's just a thought.
Yeah, I think that that's very interesting and maybe true. It'll be hard. It'll be interesting to see how they deal with kids coming of age.
Hmm. So, just to kind of back up, I forget which book this was from when I was just doing a little bit of research on you. But one of your theories is around the three levels as it relates to gender: the individual, the interactual, and the uh, institutional. So, when you were doing research on this book, did you notice anything primarily different in how the millennial generation interprets these different roles and how they interact with each other? The different roles interacting within a system that was different from previous generations.
Well, I haven't done the same research on all different generations. So, what I'll tell you a little bit about is how millennials are different from one another.
Mm-hmm.
On these. Uh, and I'll start with kind of at the inner, at what about themselves and at the kind of level of individuals. What I found was that um, as I said, some millennials continue to be very traditional around gender, and these are the millennials that are most likely to be in adherence of in traditional religious communities. And although, as you say, many millennials have left or are not practicing, I just want to reassert that there are some millennials who are very religious in traditional faith communities. And they tend to be quite conservative in thinking that men should be heads of the households and that men and women are very different and that women shouldn't try to be assertive and aggressive, and that men shouldn't be touchy-feely and emotional. And so I just want to say that there are some millennials out there who still subscribe to that. Probably, I don't have good national data on this and representative samples, probably less than 5%, but still some of them are out there. I would bet the about a third. Again, I'm my qualitative research can't speak to this, but some other people's quantitative research can, and that is about there are many millennials who are quite committed to gender equality. And I think one thing that makes this group of millennials different from other people and from other um, generations is that feminism isn't only for women anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to millennial men who were far more feminist than some of the millennial women I talked to. And so I think that that's really different from in previous generations. You could almost use a synonym, the women's movement and the feminist movement. It was like two words for the same concept, but I don't think that's true anymore. I think that there are, in fact, millennial men who are very committed to gender equality and see that it has real benefits not only for women, but also for themselves. Because when we have very sharp uh, stereotypes and we impose them on people around gender, what we do is we cut off women from the capabilities that they have to be leaders and effective and aggressive and powerful, and we cut men off from their ability to be warm and nurturant and committed and and really very emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there are both women and men, but what's new is the men who get this and do not want to reproduce it. And I think that shows up in the data on um, household division of labor. That is about a third of millennials now report in heterosexual couples sharing equally the work of earning a living and cleaning the house, and if they have children, raising their children. Now, you will read these horrible arguments in the newspaper all the time and on the internet how the data shows that men still do less housework than women. And that's absolutely the case because a third, when you look at statistical analyses, a third of the majority, that means two-thirds are not, right? And so in any analysis, you're going to get statistical sex differences on who's doing what. But I think that undercuts the changes that we have made because a generation ago it was almost nobody.
Mm-hmm.
We're a third. Well, that's a big change. And I think that we don't give millennial men enough credit for that. And so I call those people the innovators in my book. Um, then I think the other huge change that millennials have spearheaded, but I don't think they're the generation where we will see this most common. I think it will be the generations younger than millennials. And that are the people who I call in my book the rebels. My next book will be just on these folks. And I now refer to them as non-binary
Hmm.
or people who reject categories. And that is people who so distrust the stereotypes and the expectations that come with with being referred to as a woman or a man, that they say that's not who I am, and therefore I'm not a woman or a man. I'm between the binary, so to speak. And so in my millennial book, which was published in 2018, but I collect the data in 2012 and 2013. And so it was just at the beginning of people doing this. And the current book I'm writing now, I'm interviewing with a team of collaborators, people who reject gender categories, and some of them are millennials. But what the data seems to be showing on the national trend is the younger you are, the more people are doing this,
Hmm.
rejecting categories altogether. Um, and so, among millennials, those people exist, but they are while a tiny minority. I think culturally they have a very big presence because think about it. In the last 3 or 4 years, we have had legal category X, meaning people can choose to be an X rather than a male or a female on their birth certificate, not on their birth certificate, on their driver's license.
Hmm.
Met in Washington, Oregon, California, uh, and Massachusetts. And they're probably, that's the last time I looked. Who knows what other states have adopted that since then, and in other countries as well. And so I think that while there are not a lot of these people at the moment, I think they are a cultural marker for a kind of rejection of the kind of imposition of gender on individuals. And it takes us to the next level of gender, as I call it, which is that gender isn't only about how we feel about ourselves, it's also, and maybe how we feel about ourselves is a product of this, what other people expect of us. So that because I am a woman, if I am very directive, and I am, and I will be called a bossy or a bitch. If I were a man, I'd be called a great leader because the same behavior is expected from men and it's seen as inappropriate from women. And I think that boys understand this quite well because if a girl cries when she gets hurt, people say, "Oh dear, are you okay?" If a boy cries when he gets hurt, someone's likely to say, "Hey, man out," right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember when I was in football, my coach would say, "Don't cry, just rub some dirt on it, you'll be fine." But you know what? I think that that perception of I guess personality traits as well is maybe why millennial men are a little bit different because I mean I look at just like family trends, my dad, my grandpa, going back, didn't never express themselves, just come home after work, definitely with a pissed off look on their face, instead of, talking to my mom or whatever, they just have a drink and just sit and stew in it. And, I've looked at, both of them over time and, there hasn't been much growth from, that kind of emotional level. And, I don't know. I feel like the millennial generation as well. We're a little bit more more programmed, I guess you could say, towards self improvement. Primarily, being born in like the '80s, early '90s when the self help boom was happening in that. But we're always looking for a way to kind of improve our conditions because I mean, in a lot of ways, we can improve our conditions economically.
I, Interesting. Uh, But I do think that the self-help movement is part of pushing people to think more broadly about how they can be different. I also think a little bit of credit should be given here to the feminist movement,
Oh yeah.
which did this out over and over again to both men and women. The downside of this, but even this has a lot. These are has deep roots. There was something called the human potential movement in the 1970s that also really push men to try to get in touch with their emotions. And so I do think that these personality traits, as you call them, are deeply programmed, and they're part and parcel of how we bring children up. These expectations that we have of boys and girls get deeply programmed into their psyches from early ages, right? And so I think the very notion now that we're beginning to try to dress children in more gender neutral outfits
Hmm.
will has long-term consequences, because when you put a little girl in a little pink outfit and a bow on her head, what you're doing is screaming to everyone who sees her, you treat her gently. Make sure you help her grow up to be soft and gentle, and to hide any part of herself that isn't soft or gentle. And when you put boys in little clothes that have trucks and footballs on them,
Yeah.
and you buy them little trucks to sit in, you're teaching them to be tough, and to tell everybody who sees them to treat them like a little boy. And so I think self-improvement is possible, and I do think people can change, but I think that the reason as we're adults we have to work so hard at changing is because partly of how we're socialized in such, and even when we try not to socialize children as parents, the world around them, right? The boys and girls toys aisles in the stores socialize them. And so that the expectations that we all deal with as children and then again as adults affect how we behave and what we expect of ourselves. And I think that's really important, but it doesn't even stop there, because at that next level, at the institutional or the macro level, we've organized a society around a world where men and women are supposed to be different, because to work 24/7, to be available to your boss 24/7, the way we've moved from 40 hours a week to everybody having, being online on nights and weekends and on
Hmm.
vacations, means that there's a kind of expectation that a really successful worker doesn't have any work to do other than the work for their boss. That is, they don't have any family work, they don't have any caretaking work. Well, who's most likely to succeed in a world where you don't where only people who don't care for other people can be considered really successful? Well, people who historically men and people without children. And so we've built in this what I call advantages for male privilege into our labor force, affirmative action for men, if you will, into the way we structure jobs, because we presume that people don't have caretaking responsibilities, and those people who do have caretaking responsibilities are disadvantaged, which I think brings us in a really nice way back to where we started this conversation, which is look at what's happening in this pandemic crisis. All of a sudden, we have all these young families with who are expected to work from home if they're lucky. That is, the ones who don't have to go out and expose themselves,
Hmm.
working in a grocery line all day. But the lucky ones who have homes to live in and jobs that can go online, they're home and expected to both get their work done and homeschool their kids at the same time. And that is totally impossible. And we need to rethink, use this moment in our economic um, history to say, wow, this brings home the notion that we have to create and organize the economy, presuming that every worker has, at some point in their lives, caretaking responsibilities. Maybe they never have children, maybe they do. If they do, those children ought to, excuse my language, damn well be as much their father's responsibility as their mother's. But almost all of us will someday have parents who are old and may need help going to the doctor and somebody to watch them when they're not feeling well.
Mm-hmm.
And we will all have partners or friends who will need us after they come out of surgery for a few days, right? All of this, we have a figment of our cultural imagination. Sociologists call this cultural logics. That is somehow there's a some mother or grandmother or single aunt around to take care of all of this. Well, there isn't. And the pandemic shows us this in a really vibrant color that we have to organize the economy in some way that presumes that everybody who has to earn a living also, not all the time, but at some moments in their lives, will also have to take care of other human beings. And we have to figure out a way to make that possible. And that really will be when the gender revolution has succeeded.
Yeah, I mean, we went back to this pandemic, and the one thing that I find truly ironic is that the entire economy, world, country that we have right now is in the hands and on the backs of those people who are quote unquote essential, right? The same people who work at the grocery stores, work these low wage jobs. The country's now depending on them, and a couple months back, we don't even want to give them health care. And I mean, just looking at you talked about aging parents as well. I mean, if you look at the state of our healthcare system, I mean, a lot of the baby boomer generation, like, they're not going to be able to afford it or afford retirement homes, or to be able to be taken care of with in-home healthcare. I mean, it's going to fall back on the family structure. And I mean, it's interesting because I mean, overall, we're at a place where the traditional family structure has kind of broken down in a lot of ways, and really, it takes these types of experiences, pandemics, to kind of refocus on what should be important in our lives, and that should be being empathetic and being able to be there for your community.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's worth saying again that we are depending right now for all of us to be able to eat and get our medicine and be safe have from vandalism on working class people who do not necessarily make a living wage and mostly don't even now have health care or sick leave or benefits. And I think that is something that we should learn from this and realize that every that healthcare shouldn't be tied to jobs, that should be a right of citizenship, which it is in almost every other industrialized country,
Mm-hmm.
except the United States. Uh, in terms of the family structure breaking down, I'm here going to be a sociologist here and just make that a little more complicated. I think actually what we've seen in the 21st century is that the divorce rate has fallen quite a lot for some people, but not others. And that the rate of marriage has fallen for some people and not others. And that is what we have now is quite a bifurcated, class based, two different family systems. That is, middle class people who are college educated are still very likely to marry, almost always marry before their first child is born, and are far less likely to get divorced than they were 20 years ago.
Really?
Those who are not college educated people are far less likely to get married than in any time in our past. They're less likely to get married before they have their first child. And if they do marry, they are more likely to get divorced. And so what we have is a kind of bifurcated family system, which is a family system that depends on economic security and and is precarious for those people who are in precarious situations otherwise. That is, marriage has come to be something that is called an achievement. You can afford to get married when both people have good wages. And that's when people get married. And historically, when people get married, when they both have good wages, their marriages are longer term. So nowadays, people don't get married until they can, quote unquote, afford to. But that leaves some people out. And it's those people who have more precarious family forms. And in fact, um, I think going forward, we're going to have to find a way to take care of our elders in more community, as a more of a community, and not presume that they have family members who can take care of them.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. One of the things that I think, a lot. I don't want to say confuses a lot of people, but that a lot of people don't take into account is the role that gender or the way that gender roles and economics are brought together. For instance, one of the most right wing talking points that I see out there as far as the gender wage gap, right, is that, well, men just take professions that are, pay more. They're more dangerous, yada, yada, yada. And I don't think people realize that the difference between blue collar and pink collar jobs is, directly related to legislation and funding for social service programs. So a lot of the wage gap itself, because women, a lot of, I don't want to say a lot, but a good portion of like social workers, psychology, a lot of that are filled by women. And these government programs and the funding for them, that has a direct relation to the wages that they have, because a lot of these social services, they're underfunded, and some of them, I mean, they just exist on shoestring budgets.
Absolutely. The kinds of jobs, one way that gender discrimination works is that the kinds of jobs that women do, the kinds of work that women have traditionally done around caretaking, once you put it into the economy, which is what child care workers and elementary school teachers and nurses are, is underpaid because we undervalue women. And so that a great deal of the difference between men and women's wages is the jobs that they work in are so differently valued. But it is also the case that when women and men work in the same jobs, there's still a very large pay gap. And in fact, I happen to be the editor of a journal called Gender and Society, and we have a article we're publishing in about 2 months from now that shows that not only is there a wage gap between men and women, there's also a benefits gap. That is, those jobs that men are most likely to work in are much more likely to have paid sick leave and retirement. And so that's another way we devalue women's jobs.
And that is so backwards as well, because usually if there's going to be family issues, sick leave as far as for kids and that, it's usually always the woman of the household that's going to take time off of work to do that. So having men have better rates of benefits than women in those roles is just preposterous, based on the family roles that we were just discussing.
Now, I think that that's true.
I think I don't know. I feel like overall a lot of that. goes back to just the healthcare workers getting paid less. I feel like a lot of that just has a lot to do with a decrease in empathy just in American culture and society. From a sociological perspective, what do you think has caused us to become so desensitized to each other's suffering and needs?
I think that our cultural stories are all about individualism. That is, everyone is responsible for themselves. And so that leads to a great deal of um, devaluing of the interconnectedness of human life and humankind. That's really a myth. No one is self-built. Everyone is connected to the mentors and the parents and the luck of the draw for how much wealth they were born into. And so I think that the cultural story about Horatio Alger and bu- pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is really the ideas that we take for granted that devalue the people who take care of other people. And I think that if nothing else, I hope that we learn something from this horrible moment in time to value the people who take care of uh, and work in the service economy.
And I don't know. I guess that's one of the things that I find is very important about gender studies in general is that it seems to be a matrix for all these different intersecting issues. I mean, both at an individual level and at society at large. And I don't know. I feel like that's why maybe it's such a decisive issue as well. Is that just kind of backtrack. We were talking about how people are. Programmed, with these different roles and how their identities feed into that. And, the idea of gender studies, for a lot of folks, it challenges their individual identity and their sense of individualism because they chose to accept these roles and this and that. So really, when you have someone who's non-binary, acting different or talking, a different perspective on gender, it really just makes those people feel challenged at their sense of identity as well as their own sense of morality. And I think that's where a lot of the division and angry tweets come into play.
I may be, and I think in some ways, some of the non-binary people that I talk to actually intend to challenge others and to make them wonder about why we have such uh, polarity between what we expect for women and men.
So let me ask you, just I guess, American culture at large. What do you think? I get well, also from a more broader sociological perspective. What do you think is responsible for the divisions that we're seeing today?
That's a very big question. The divisions about gender, I think, are the ones that I'm most comfortable talking about. And I think that part of the debate right now is really a backlash against change. That, in fact, we have had a great deal of change. If you look at the long sweep of history in the end of the 20th century, and that has been very comfortable for some people and it's advantaged many people, but it has also been deeply unsettling. In the book I wrote on the millennials, I had more people than not feel rather confused and confounded about these changes and feeling as if some things work and some things have changed and other things haven't, and just not really, and in some sense it's straddling this line of I want to change but I don't want to change, I believe in change but I don't know how to live it. And so I think that we should use some empathy here and realize that change is really difficult and it's easier for some than for others. And that I think part of the divisiveness and the polarity is because people are unsure of what has changed, what should change, and how they should be. And that's really hard. And so that um, I think some of the divisiveness is a kind of reactivity to not being comfortable with change.
Well, and I think a lot of it as well is that for the first time, millennial generation, we're uncertain about our future. Boomers for the most part, Gen X, like, as they, got into their job roles and as they went through life, they kind of had this expectation of how their retirement and life would pan out. But millennials, I mean, that's all up in the air. I mean, I question if I'm going to even be able to rely on Social Security in the future, 20, 30 years down the line. So when you look at uncertainty, it allows you to want to make those drastic changes. And I think that one of the biggest fallbacks for millennials is that we think change should be instant, right? A lot of that I feel goes back to the internet as well. Everything, needs to be spontaneous. We need to have our needs met immediately. But change is very hard. It's very gradual. It's a very slow process. And I think that's why a lot of millennials kind of get so frustrated and feel this sense of like existential dread.
Right. I do think that millennials are facing an uncertain economic future, and that is always unsettling. I do think that change is often slow and gradual, but sometimes there are moments in history when it's fast and revolutionary. And so I think that we can't take for granted it's always slow and and gradual, and we have to wait for it every once in a while, and it doesn't always happen in the direction we want to go. Sometimes fascists fascists are elected or um, take over, and change is quick and drastic and isn't necessarily in progressive directions. So I think we should realize that change comes in all different ways.
Oh, absolutely. And well, I mean, I don't know. I think we're in one of those periods right now where folks usually will take they say you take two steps forward, one step back. I mean, we're definitely in a moment where we're about to take, or we have been taking, a step, maybe a step and a half back. Because I mean, you look at trends all over the world. You have nationalism on the rise everywhere. You have people who are have completely lost faith in a lot of these institutions that I mean, will allow a two-bit carnival barker to challenge institutions of justice and checks and balances without even batting an eye. Um, but when you look at I guess the hopeful future, going forward and taking into account historical patterns, where do you think millennials will take us in the next 20, 30 years? I mean, I would say both economically, politically, and relates to gender.
Well, I'll start with relating to gender because that's what I'm an expert on. And I think we will see, as we go forward, less and less support for the kind of public policies that require people to stay in particular gendered positions. Because I think millennials are very, in that sense, what I call libertarian around gender or progressive. That is, they whatever they choose for themselves, they do not want to impose on other people. I think we will continue to see uh, women in the labor force full time, even women with very traditional political politics. Think Sarah Palin, right? A vice presidential candidate who had an infant in her arms when she was on the Republican platform. That was a while ago, but I think I think we will continue to see that. I think we will continue to see slow but steady progress in the e- growing equality in heterosexual marriages between women and men. And I also think we will see more and more people, at least in the near distant future, who reject gender categories and claim the uh, identity of non binary because the gender categories continue to feel oppressive to them. And the expectations that surround those categories continue to feel oppressive. I'm unlikely to make a prediction about our politics right now. At the moment, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we don't even have um, the political leadership to provide for the most basic needs of our healthcare workers. And I think that at the moment, it's trying to understand and explain this and make sure it never happens again is the political question of the day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and I don't know. I feel that like yeah, I find it very disheartening that even though through all of this mismanagement, gutting the CDC, firing all the pandemic experts in 2018, refusing test kits from the World Health Organization. I mean, just basic incompetence. The president's poll numbers have still gone up in response to how he's handling the crisis. So how do you get more Americans kind of out of their little bubble and engaged in, the objective truth that's going on?
I do not know. I find it almost impossible to believe that anyone thinks this is being handled well when today we became the leaders in the world in the number of people who have the virus. So
Yeah,
it is.
yeah, and then just to interrupt you rudely, you're just gonna have some Americans sitting there going, "Well, we're number one," and it doesn't matter because they'll trust the spin before they trust the facts. Well, I guess let me ask you: has there been any other periods in history where you've kind of seen these little social bubbles come up to where you're having differences in objective truth in political discussion?
I think first of all, I want to say right clearly this is not my area of research. So I'm speaking in general, sort of sociological terms
Right,
here,
right.
and that is, I think that what's very different now from the past, every past, is that in the modern era, there used to be three major television stations. We all got our news from the same three teams. We all there was the internet has exploded the um, community of information that we all used to share, and I think that is really um, that is really exacerbates this living in different worlds. There used to be cults who had different realities, but for a cult leader to um, be successful, and it was usually a he, would have to, take the people and isolate them from the rest of the world.
Hmm.
Now, all you have to do is make sure they only, that they watch a certain set of programs and only listen to a certain set of podcasts and go to a certain set of Reddit feeds. And you can have the same kind of narrowness. And so we've lost the sort of the cultural narrative that having three major stations and the PBS used to give us.
Well,
So I think that is really different now than it has been in the past.
Well, yeah, and a lot of that goes back to just getting rid of the fairness doctrine as well. I mean, I think once they got rid of the fairness doctrine, you saw, or media companies saw how profitable political spin and bias actually was, because it just reinforces that narrative that you want to believe in, and it's gotten to the point where we have two conflicting narratives in this country, and when that has happened in, well, I wouldn't say it's happened this way in the past, but usually in the past when you had these major differences, whether it be the civil rights movement, you were still able to find those common values that you can relate to other Americans on. And with the civil rights movement, it was empathy, right? After white people, even if they were biased, saw these attack dogs and these hoses and these horrific images, that basic human empathy has overcame that situation, right? That like gut feeling that you knew what was right, what was wrong, and I feel that, like, with these different ecospheres, in certain cases, you are being programmed to have less empathy for the other side, and vice versa, which I find truly scary.
Yes, it is scary.
So I guess we're getting towards the end here. Just to go ahead and kind of finish up. I don't know. One question that I definitely wanted to ask you is, how do you think gender roles and studying gender in general will help us kind of heal these divisions and help progress our society forward?
Well, I think that to the extent that we begin to think of men and women as just people and not organize our lives and organize our children's lives on this division as if there are two kinds of people in the world and one based on the sex category they were assigned at birth, that we will begin to have more conversations across um, what used to be a divide, and that may help families and communities begin to learn to talk more across other kinds of divides, or at least that's the only positive spin I can think of to answer your last question. But I really appreciate this conversation. It's been great fun.
Oh, absolutely, and I do appreciate you coming on because my audience, for the most part, they probably have not really looked at the idea of gender outside of what the mainstream or other talking points might have. So being able to talk with someone who's an expert like yourself, to be able to kind of shed more light on the importance of it, is definitely beneficial. And I want to thank you for taking the time in midst of everything to kind of talk with me. And then your book is available on Amazon. That is going to be Where the Millennials Will Take Us: A New Generation Wrestles with the Gender Structure. It's also available on Google Play Books, Barnes and Noble, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your books, ladies and gentlemen. And you could also touch base and keep up with Barbara at www.barbarareisman.com. And then let me ask you, where else can folks touch base with you?
They can follow me on Twitter as well at BJ Risman.
Fantastic. So, if you have a Twitter handle, you're interested in actually getting a factual and I would say a factual as well as very interesting take on gender from an expert in the field, definitely give her a follow. I'm sure your posts are a lightning rod of both viewpoints. So, once again, folks, if you're going to get involved in conversations on Twitter, please keep it civil, and remember that there is someone else on the other end of that keyboard. So make sure that you are structuring your conversations in a beneficial way. Awesome. Then, yep, folks, we are out of here. Make sure to give us a like and a subscribe. And remember to share this link with anybody who you may or may have an interest in gender studies. Goodbye, folks.
Bye.